It was just a standard repair, nothing unusual. At first, I didn't think much about it. I was 60, living on my own in a quiet, predictable world. I hadn't felt the excitement of desire for longer than I was comfortable admitting. But that Wednesday afternoon, when Jacob came through my door, he was young, strong, and full of a nervous charm that made me feel something shift inside me. What started as a harmless encounter soon turned into something more complex. Our professional meetings started to feel more tense. As I crossed boundaries I hadn't even known existed, I realized that the line between need and obsession was getting pretty blurry. I hadn't planned for this. I hadn't planned for it, but it had awakened something in me I couldn't ignore. I had been watching the leaking sink for days, watching the water collect in the basin. It was a constant reminder of how much I needed to pay more attention to my surroundings. After spending years making careful home improvements, it felt pointless without someone to share them with. After my divorce, the house had grown too big. Each room echoed with memories. I tried not to think about the kitchen, which had once been the heart of our family life. It had fallen into a bit of disrepair, much like me. When the sink leak became too much to ignore, I finally did something I hadn't done in a long time. It had been a while since I'd done that. I called for assistance and found a local handyman named Jacob. I didn't know his last name, but I knew he could get the job done. I thought he'd be an older guy, maybe a little rough around the edges, but when I opened the door that chilly Wednesday afternoon, I found myself staring at Jacob, who was a young guy in his 20s, about 6 feet 2 inches, and wearing a simple gray shirt that stretched across his broad chest. He had a nervous smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but there was something about him that made me feel like I could trust him. "I'm here to take a look at the sink," he said. He had a deep, soft voice. I blinked, momentarily startled by the way my heart skipped just slightly in my chest. It was an absurd reaction, really. At my age, I was supposed to be past all that. And yet there it was, a brief spark of something I hadn't felt in years. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. I let him into the house and watched him move through the space. He looked around the kitchen, taking everything in. He got the job done quickly, kneeling down to check out the sink and moving around the pipes like he'd done it 1,000 times. I found myself hanging around nearby, unable to look away. I stood by the kitchen. I was pretending to be busy with something else, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. There was something about the way he moved, the strength in his arms as he tightened the bolts under the sink, the quiet concentration on his face. It had been ages since I'd been this close to a young man. I hadn't even considered it. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something inside me was stirring. It wasn't just about his looks, though. Jacob was undeniably attractive in that rugged, effortless way. It was the energy he brought into the room. He had a lot of energy, which was a stark contrast to the silence that had settled over the house. I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced in a long time during my time there. I found myself leaning against the counter, watching him too closely. I adjusted my robe, which I had never thought was particularly revealing, and straightened up, trying to shake the ridiculous thoughts that were creeping into my mind. Jacob looked up from his work and met my gaze. I could see the flicker of surprise in his expression as he looked at me quickly, then back to the sink. His cheeks flushed slightly, and I got a little thrill from the reaction. It was just innocent enough, but I felt something stirring that I hadn't allowed myself to feel for so long. I hadn't allowed myself to feel desire for a long time. I went over to where he was kneeling, watching him work. He was focused, but there was a nervous energy in the way his hands moved, as if he were trying not to acknowledge my presence too much. Everything was going well down there? I asked, my voice gentler. I didn't mean to, but I reached out and touched his shoulder. He tensed up, and I got this rush of power from knowing I'd made an impact. It was a feeling I hadn't had in years, and I wasn't quite ready to let it go just yet. I hadn't felt that way in years, and I wasn't ready to let it go just yet. You're really strong, I said, my voice taking on a flirtatious tone. He looked up at me, surprised, his face turning even redder. Thanks, I said, smiling at him. It was a soft, knowing smile. I could feel the tension between us growing and intensifying. The atmosphere in my kitchen was thick with unspoken tension. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly trying to stay professional, but I could see the way his hands trembled slightly as he tightened the last bolt. I moved a little closer, leaning over the counter to keep an eye on him. He stood up and wiped his hands on a rag. I could tell he was avoiding my gaze and trying to stay calm. Do you need any help with that? I asked, knowing full well he didn't need any help. He shook his head quickly and started packing up his tools, but his hands were shaking. I reached out again, letting my fingers brush against his arm. I touched his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin under my hand. He paused for a moment, and I could see the internal struggle playing out in his eyes. I could tell there was a part of him that wanted to give in, but there was also a part of him that knew better. He was younger, and I was a woman who should have known better too, but in that moment it didn't matter. I kept my hand on his arm, feeling the tension between us crackle like electricity. He looked at me, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide and uncertain. For a moment, I thought he might come closer, but then he took a step back. I'm sorry, but I think I need to break the spell, he said, his voice shaky. I'm just here to fix the sink. I smiled and asked, is there anything else that needs fixing? His tools, and I could see he was having a tough time keeping his cool. I took a step closer, my lips just inches from his. There's something else you could take care of for me, I said quietly, my voice low and suggestive. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me, frozen in place. I leaned in as if I were about to kiss him. He took a quick step back, putting his hands up in front of him as if to ward me off. I can't, he said, shaking his head. I pouted a little, feeling a bit disappointed, but I knew he wasn't going to give in, not yet anyway. He left in a hurry, practically running out of the house, leaving me standing there. I was left alone in the kitchen again, but there was something about the way he left that didn't seem right. It wasn't just the awkwardness, there was a tension in the air, like there was something unfinished or unresolved. I sensed that while Jacob had said no, it wasn't because he wasn't interested, it was because he didn't trust. The days that followed were a strange mix of excitement and frustration. I couldn't stop thinking about Jacob. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd hesitated and the way his eyes had lingered on me just a little too long. It had been years since I'd felt this way, since I'd felt anything really, and now suddenly. There was this young man who had somehow managed to get my attention. I'd assumed that something like that had long since ceased to exist. I didn't think I'd see him again. I figured he'd probably told himself he wasn't going to come back, that he couldn't come back. A week later, my phone rang out of the blue. I didn't recognize the number, but when I answered, it was Jacob on the line. I'm the plumber. I just wanted to check in and see if everything's okay with the sink. Did the fix hold up? His voice was polite and professional, but I could hear a slight tremble in it. He seemed a little nervous, which I found a little thrilling, if I'm being honest. "Oh, Jacob," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. I had a feeling what he was going to say next, but I was still surprised when he told me, "The sink is fine, but there's another issue in the bathroom." I was hoping he'd take a look at it, even though I knew it was probably nothing major. I felt better knowing he'd done a thorough inspection. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him thinking about whether he should come back. He said he could be there in about an hour. I couldn't help but smile to myself. This time I was determined not to let him off the hook so easily. When Jacob arrived, he seemed more nervous than the first time. He kept his cool and acted like he always does, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. The faucet issue was pretty minor, just a loose handle. I knew it wasn't the faucet that brought him back to work. I stood nearby, watching him in silence. He was as calm and professional as usual, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, and the way he avoided my gaze as I led him upstairs to the bathroom. The faucet issue was minor, just a loose handle, but I knew it wasn't what brought him back as he worked. I stood nearby, watching him without saying anything. There was a palpable tension between us. I could tell there was still tension between us, even though we weren't saying anything. He was more focused this time, keeping his head down and his eyes on the task at hand. But I could tell he was more aware of me and the distance between us. I couldn't hold out any longer. "Jacob," I said quietly, moving a little closer. He'd been thinking about you, too." He paused for a moment, his hand tightening around the faucet. He didn't look up, but I could see his knuckles turning white and his breathing getting a little faster. He was cautious in his voice, as though he wasn't sure if he should acknowledge what had happened before. "I haven't had a chance to do that yet." I couldn't stop thinking about what happened last time. I carried on, my voice low and intimate. "You seemed interested, but you didn't push the issue. Why was that?" He didn't respond at first, still working on the faucet, but I could see he was conflicted. "I'm a professional, that's all," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "Would that be the right thing to do?" I asked, moving even closer. I could feel the heat radiating off him now. "Who's to say what's right or wrong? Jacob, you're an adult, and I'm an adult. We both know what's going on here. There's something here, something between us you can feel, right?" He looked at me, then his jaw clenched and his eyes filled with the same conflict that had been there the last time he was struggling. I could see it. He was trying to stay professional and keep things professional between us, but the tension had already reached a point where I wasn't going to let it go. I let my hand rest on his chest, feeling his heartbeat and his breathing getting faster. For a second, I thought he might step back, but then he reached out and grabbed my arm, pulling me toward him. It wasn't rough, but it was definitely firm. His face was now just inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and intense. "This isn't a game." "I never said it was." "There's no turning back now," I replied, my lips curling into a smile. Jacob's hands were still on my arm, a little hesitant, as if he wasn't sure if he should let go. His expression was now raw and unguarded. He was still a bit nervous, but there was something different about his eyes now. They met my gaze, and I could feel the tension between us shift into something deeper. It was risky. I got a little closer, letting my lips hover just inches from his. His grip tightened, as though he was trying to hold me closer while pushing me away at the same time. For a moment, I wondered if he'd break if he walked out the door and never came back. But then his breathing quickened, and I knew he was feeling the same thing. "I've been in your shoes. I knew you just had to let go," I quietly said. My voice was barely audible, but I made it clear what I meant. Jacob paused for a moment, and then, as if he'd made a decision, he pulled me in closer and kissed me. It wasn't as gentle or tentative as before. This kiss was full of everything we'd both been holding back. His lips moved against mine with a kind of urgency that made me shiver. His hands tightened on my waist as if he were afraid to let go. I kissed him back. Wrapping my arms around his neck and pulling him closer. The heat between us grew stronger with each passing second, and the world around us seemed to blur. The bathroom, the sink, the leak, it all disappeared as he touched me. His hands moved down to my hips, and I could feel the tension in his body. He was holding back, afraid of going too far, but he was already too far gone. We took a quick break to catch our breath. Our foreheads were pressed together, and we were breathing in short, uneven gasps. I could feel his heart beating fast against his chest and his pulse racing beneath my fingers. The look in his eyes said it all. This wasn't just a moment of weakness for him. This was something he'd been working towards for a long time. He hadn't been ready to admit it to himself. "What's next?" he inquired. He spoke in a barely audible whisper. He looked at me, searching for answers. I gave him a smile. I took a step back, giving him some space, but not too far. I could sense a growing attraction between us. There was an undeniable connection. That's what led us to this point. "I think you know the answer to that, Jacob," I said softly, with a quiet confidence in my voice. I hadn't felt like this in years. We've already gone beyond what was acceptable. Why not just go for it? He paused for a moment, seemingly lost for words. He just stood there, watching me. He was still conflicted, but then, with one last look at the door, he reached for me again. His hands found my waist again, pulling me closer. This time, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. This time, we both knew what we were getting into. The rest of the afternoon was a bit of a blur. Jacob and I barely made it out of the bathroom in time. The tension between us finally came to a head in a way that felt both inevitable and exhilarating. His hands were all over me, on my shoulders, my waist, my hips. He touched me firmly, but respectfully, as if he were loosening his grip, but still maintaining some control. But I didn't want to hold back, not now. I hadn't felt like this in years, not since before the divorce. My life had been pretty routine up until now. For a long time, I'd been eating dinner alone, watching TV in the evenings, and calling my grown children now and then. I hadn't realized how much I'd been craving this or how much I needed to feel wanted again and desired. Jacob kissed me deeply, his lips tracing down my neck, his hands moving to grip my hips. I let out a soft "ooh" and my head fell back as I gave into the moment. There was something intoxicating about being with him. He was a young, strong man who seemed to see me in a way no one had in so long. It was more than just. There was more to it than just physical attraction. It was a deeper connection, something neither of us had expected but couldn't deny. We eventually made our way to the bedroom, where I could feel the air between us was charged with a kind of energy I hadn't felt in years. As we lay together, tangled in the sheets, I couldn't help but smile, feeling more alive than I had in what felt like a lifetime. "I've never done anything like this," Jacob said quietly, lying next to me. He traced lazy circles on my arm with his fingers. "Me neither." I told him my voice was just as soft. He turned to look at me, and I saw something I hadn't expected. He seemed vulnerable. He said, "I shouldn't have, but I don't regret it." I placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat beneath my fingertips, and smiled. We sat in silence for a few minutes. We were both lost in our own thoughts. The significance of what had just happened hung in the air between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was like we'd both crossed a line. We didn't realize it was an option, but neither of us wanted to go back. After a while, Jacob sat up and looked at the clock. "I should probably head out," he said, his voice filled with a reluctance that mirrored my own. "I've been here longer than I thought I would." "You don't have to." "I know," I said, even though I already knew. He said he couldn't stay. He looked at me like he wanted to stay, but then he shook his head. He said he didn't want it to be awkward. His voice was gentle but firm. He said he didn't want me to think he was just using me as a means to an end. I gave him a smile and said I understood. I told him I didn't think so. I sat up beside him and said, "You're a good man, Jacob. We both needed this, and I'm glad it happened, but I'm not expecting anything more than what this was." He looked relieved, but there was still a hint of confusion in his eyes, as if he wasn't used to things being this simple. I asked, "Are you really okay with everything? No strange feelings or anything?" I let out a little laugh and shook my head. Jacob nodded slowly, as if he were still processing the situation. "The simplicity of it all," he said after a long pause. "I'll probably see you around." "Maybe," I joked, "if my sink breaks again, you'll be the first one I call." That made him smile, and he stood up, grabbing his tools and slinging his bag over his shoulder. But before he left, he turned back to me one last time. "Margaret," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I don't regret it. I just wanted you to know that I smiled." I gave him a smile in return, watching as he opened the door. "I don't either," I replied. He was gone just like that. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about Jacob more than I probably should have. Every time I walked past the sink, I thought about how he looked at me, how his hand shook a little when I touched his arm, how hot his kiss was, how his body pressed against mine, and how he hesitated, then finally gave in. It had been a long time since I'd felt like that, or anything like it. I wasn't expecting him to call again. I figured he probably convinced himself it was just a one-time thing. I suppose time is the only thing that matters here. It shouldn't happen again. Maybe he was right, maybe it shouldn't have happened in the first place, but I don't regret it for a second. I'm not sure if I'll ever get another chance to see him. I'm not even sure if I want to pursue it further. The logical part of me knows this is risky. There's a big age gap, a power dynamic, societal expectations, and the very real possibility that we're playing with fire. But the part of me that still has feelings for him, the part of me that felt so alive in his arms, didn't care about any of that. I knew that if he called, I'd have to take the call. Then, about a week after he left, I got a call on my phone. I saw his name on my screen, and my heart started racing. I wasn't expecting it and I wasn't really hoping for it, but there it was, his name, his number, a way back to the excitement of what we had. His voice was a little tentative and cautious, like he wasn't sure if he should be calling. I just wanted to check on the faucet to make sure everything was still working properly. There was a brief pause, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, as though he were trying to convince himself that this was still just a professional call. We both knew better. "Everything's fine with the faucet," I replied, lowering my voice just a little to let him know I wasn't talking about the sink. "There's another issue I could really use your help with." I could tell he was getting pretty nervous on the other end of the line. I could tell he was thinking it over, deciding whether or not he should come back. "I'll be there in an hour," Jacob said. His voice was barely audible, as though he were unsure of the decision he'd just made. But deep down, I knew we couldn't stay away from each other any longer than I could resist asking him back. When I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of excitement. It had been a while since I felt this way. I felt a kind of excitement, a mixture of nervous energy and raw desire, like a current. I told myself it was just a brief indulgence, nothing serious, nothing long-term. But the truth was, it had already become more than that. I spent the next hour pacing around the house, doing odd jobs that didn't really need to be done, trying to calm the excitement that was building inside me. This wasn't like me at all. I've never been the type to lose control or get swept up in something so reckless. But with Jacob, all of those carefully constructed walls I'd built up over the years seemed to come tumbling down when he finally arrived. I got that same rush all over again. He stood in the doorway, looking a bit unsure, but clearly drawn to the connection between us. His eyes met mine, and I saw the same flicker of uncertainty that had been there the last time, but there was something else too, something darker and more intense. He stepped inside, and I could feel the electricity between us grow. I didn't say much as I led him to the bathroom, making up some minor issue that needed fixing, but we both knew why he was really there as soon as we were alone in the bathroom. There was a change in the atmosphere between us. Jacob tried to focus on the task at hand, adjusting the faucet, but I could see his fingers trembling slightly. He seemed nervous, but I was feeling the same way. I was uneasy about what we were doing, but more than that, I was nervous about how much I wanted this. I moved closer, watching as he pretended to inspect the faucet, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the task. The silence between us was thick with unspoken desire. I finally couldn't take it anymore. I reached out and placed my hand lightly on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his skin. I touched Jacob through his shirt, and he stopped moving. His body went stiff for a moment, and he didn't move or even breathe. Then he turned slowly to face me. His eyes showed the same conflict I had seen before. "Jacob," I said quietly, but firmly. "You don't have to act like this anymore." His breathing became uneven, and I thought he might pull away again. He might just walk away, like he did last time. But then something changed inside him. His expression changed, and he lost his resolve. He let his walls down, and without another word, he pulled me into his arms. His lips met mine in a passionate kiss. He kissed me hard, leaving me breathless. This time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. This time, Jacob wasn't holding back. His hands explored my body, his touch urgent and thrilling. I kissed him back, tangling my fingers in his hair as I got closer to him, lost in the moment. We didn't stop. The bathroom felt a bit too small and confined for what was going on between us. Without breaking the kiss, Jacob picked me up and carried me to the bedroom. The usual boundaries between us disappeared completely. The next few hours were a bit of a blur, but it was a great time. The world outside receded as we yielded to the desire we had both striven to suppress. Jacob's hands moved over my body with a kind of reverence. He had the same need I did, and in those moments, nothing else mattered. I felt like I was truly alive. I felt more alive than I had in years. It was as if the years had melted away, and I was no longer the woman who had spent so much of her life stuck in a routine in the quiet loneliness of a big empty house with Jacob. I felt like I was wanted and desired. There was no shame, no guilt. There was just a certain heat between us, and we both knew we needed this. Jacob's touch was a mix of tender and demanding, with a hint of control and release. He kissed me with a hunger that caught me off guard. His lips explored mine with a passion that made my heart beat faster. I kissed him back, just as passionately, pulling him closer, determined not to let the moment slip away. Afterwards, when we were all tangled up together and our bodies were spent, the silence between us was actually quite comforting. I could feel Jacob's breath on my neck, slow and steady as his fingers traced patterns on my skin. I imagined patterns on my skin with my mind, closing my eyes to enjoy the warmth of his body next to mine and the weight of his presence. We didn't speak for a while, because there was no need for words. We both knew that what had just happened was more than just a brief moment of passion. It was something more profound, something neither of us had anticipated but couldn't refute. It felt like for the first time in years, I was truly seen as more than just a 60-year-old woman. I'm a 60-year-old woman, not just someone's ex. I was married, but I saw her as a person, as a woman who still had the capacity to feel, to desire, to live. But, as they say, reality has a way of creeping back in, no matter how much you try to hold it at bay. As the hours went by, I started to feel the weight of what had happened settling on me. Jacob was quite young, much younger than me. At the time, the age difference didn't seem to matter. In the heat of the moment, though, I knew it couldn't be ignored forever. I looked over at Jacob, who was still lying beside me. He was resting with his eyes closed and breathing evenly. He looked relaxed, but I wondered how long that would last. How long would it take for him to realize that I was starting to think about the complications of what we were doing? I realized that he might start to pull away. I got a sudden feeling of fear. I hadn't foreseen this. I hadn't planned to feel anything more than a passing interest, but now lying here beside him I knew it was more than that. I had developed a connection with him. I was more attached to him than I had ever planned. I slowly sat up, being careful not to wake him, and covered myself with the blanket. I watched the last rays of the afternoon sun disappear behind the trees, leaving the room bathed in a soft golden glow. I had a feeling this couldn't last. I knew that the logical part of me knew. I knew this was just a temporary situation. I knew that whatever we had shared was going to end, but another part of me, a part one hadn't acknowledged until now, wanted it to last. I wanted Jacob to stay, and that scared me. The days that followed were a strange mix of longing and uncertainty. Jacob and I kept seeing each other. We were still on speaking terms, but there was a shift in the dynamic. He was still kind and attentive, but there was a distance between us now, and an unspoken tension that neither of us could ignore. I knew it wasn't intentional. Jacob was trying to hold on to whatever we had, but I could see the conflict in his eyes every time we were together. He was young with his whole life ahead of him, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was starting to regret the path we had taken. The age difference, which had once felt like a thrilling taboo, now seemed to hang over us like a shadow. I could see the way people looked at us when we were out in public. They seemed curious. The judgmental looks. It didn't matter that I felt younger when I was with Jacob. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. To the outside world, we were something out of the ordinary, something that didn't fit the norm. Over time, I started to feel the weight of that judgment. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, I had a realization. Jacob reached for my hand. His touch was warm and comforting, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel uneasy. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice a little hesitant. "I'm not sure how to start this conversation." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I nodded, encouraging him to continue. "This is a tricky situation," I said. He said it softly, but firmly. "I don't regret anything, but I'm not sure how to make this work." I understood what he was saying. I had been dreading this conversation, but I knew it was coming. We'd crossed a line, and now we were both trying to figure out where we stood. "You don't have to explain," I said calmly. Even though I was a bit nervous, I knew this was going to be a challenge. Jacob looked at me, his eyes betraying his sadness. He said, "I don't want to hurt you," but then he added, "I can't keep pretending that this is normal." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I managed to stay calm. I had a feeling this was going to happen. I'd been aware for a while that our relationship was on shaky ground and that it wouldn't last forever. But even knowing that didn't make it any easier. After that conversation, things started to fall apart between us. We still saw each other, but the easy intimacy we'd once shared was gone. It was replaced by a kind of awkwardness that neither of us could shake off. I could tell that Jacob was trying to keep things professional, but I could still sense his reluctance. I didn't want to admit it, but I was afraid. I was afraid of losing him and going back to feeling isolated in my house, and having the days stretch out in front of me with nothing to do. It all seemed pretty overwhelming. After everything that had happened with Jacob, I sat alone in the living room, looking at my phone, hoping it would ring. He said he'd come by that afternoon, but I hadn't seen him for hours. I felt a bit anxious in my chest. He was drifting away, and I didn't know how to stop it. After what felt like an eternity, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jacob. My apologies. I'm afraid I can't make it tonight. I just need some time to think this through. I looked at the message, feeling disappointed. I had an idea this was coming, but seeing it in writing made it feel more real. I didn't reply. I was at a loss as to what to do. Instead, I sat there in the dark, the quiet of the house weighing on me. I couldn't shake the thrill I'd felt back then. I was surprised by the hollow emptiness that replaced it. I'd assumed this was just a casual thing. I thought it would be a fun, short-term thing, something to make me feel alive, before we both moved on. I thought it would just be a fling, something that would give me a bit of a buzz before we both moved on. But it was more than that. I had let myself get emotionally involved with him, and now I was facing the consequences. A week went by, and I didn't hear from Jacob. I tried to keep myself busy, filling my days with tasks that didn't really matter, but I still felt empty inside. No matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming to an end. Whatever we had, it was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Then, one evening just as the sun was setting, my phone rang. It was Jacob on the phone. He asked, "Can I stop by?" His voice was soft and almost. I was a little unsure, but I replied. I had a feeling what he was going to say when he arrived. There was a palpable tension in the air that hadn't been there before. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days, and I could see the conflict in his face. We sat down in the living room. There was a heavy silence between us, with a lot left unsaid. I waited for him to speak, but it was clear he was struggling to find the right words. "Margaret," he began, in a soft voice. "I've been thinking a lot lately." I nodded, my heart racing. "I care about you," he continued, looking at me directly. "I never thought I would, but I can't continue like this. I can't deny that there's a difference in age here. I can't deny that this is a complicated situation." I felt tears welling up, but I blinked them back, determined to stay calm. I was aware that this was likely to happen, but that didn't make it any easier. "Is it any easier?" I asked. I spoke in a quiet, almost inaudible voice. Jacob looked at me, his expression showing regret. "I don't want to hurt you, Margaret, but I think it's best if we end this now before it gets even more complicated." I nodded, not knowing what to say in response. I had an inkling all along. I knew this couldn't last, but that didn't make it any easier. Jacob reached for my hand and gave it a gentle squeeze, as if trying to offer some comfort in a moment that offered little solace. His touch was warm and familiar, but it also felt distant, like a reminder of something that was slipping away. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant for it to get this far, but I just don't know how to make this work." I looked at him, my heart breaking a little inside. He was right. We crossed a line that felt exhilarating at the time, but now we're facing the reality of it all. The age difference, the secrecy, and the uncertainty of where this could lead are all sinking in. It was too much for us both to handle. I stand by everything I said. I spoke quietly, my voice steady, despite the lump in my throat. I don't want you to think that way. Jacob's eyes softened for a moment, and I thought I saw a brief flicker of hesitation, like he was reconsidering his decision, but it disappeared just as quickly. He didn't say anything else, but I could tell he was having a tough time with this. I nodded, knowing there was nothing more to say on the matter. We had a genuine and lovely connection, but it wasn't meant to be long-term. It was a genuine and lovely connection, but it just wasn't meant to last. That was the toughest part of all. We had to accept that some things, no matter how powerful they feel in the moment, aren't meant to be forever. We sat in silence for a few moments. His hand was still wrapped around mine. It was like we were both trying to hold on to the last bit of what we had, even though we knew it was already slipping away. At last, Jacob stood up. He moved slowly and deliberately, as if he was taking a moment to process what was happening. He took a quick look around the room as if he were memorizing it, and then looked back at me. "Take care of yourself, Margaret," he said quietly. "You too, Jacob." I replied, my voice calm, but with the weight of everything we weren't saying hanging in the air. He stayed for another moment or two, then turned and walked towards the door. I watched him leave, feeling a sadness I hadn't expected. The door closed quietly behind him, and just like that, he was gone. The house felt really quiet after he left. The silence was overwhelming. I sat there for a while, looking at the door, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The excitement, the connection, the passion, it was all real, but now it's over. I got up slowly, feeling pretty tired, and made my way to the bedroom. The bed felt too big and too empty without him there with me. As I lay there in the dark, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made a mistake. Had I let things get too far ahead of me? I allowed myself to feel too much, but even as sadness washed over me, I knew I wouldn't change a thing. What I shared with Jacob had brought something back to me, something I hadn't felt in years. It made me realize that I was still capable of desire, passion, and living. I'll always be grateful for that. The days that followed felt like they were dragging by. My daily routine and the familiar patterns and empty spaces that came with it returned. But something had shifted. Even though Jacob was out of the picture, the spark he had kindled within me still flickered. I found myself thinking about him quite often. I found myself wondering what he was up to and how he was doing. I knew that ending things had been the right decision for both of us, but that didn't mean I didn't still have feelings for him. It stayed in the background, a quiet ache that I couldn't shake. I tried to take my mind off things by doing small tasks around the house, like cleaning, organizing my bookshelves, and going for long walks around the neighborhood. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the memories of Jacob. They were always there, teasing me with the possibility of what could have been. One afternoon, I was going through some old photo albums, and found a picture of myself from years ago. I was young, full of energy, and had a zest for life. I looked at it for a while, trying to match the woman in the photo with the woman I had become. I spent a lot of time trying to fit into the mold of what was expected of me, a good wife, a good mother, a responsible adult. But in trying to fit in, I lost a part of myself. Jacob made me think of that part of me, the part that craved adventure, connection, and something more than just going through the motions. Even though we're no longer together, I'm really grateful for the time we had together. He gave me something I didn't know I needed. A reminder that I was still alive and still capable of feeling. As time passed, the pain of missing Jacob gradually receded. It didn't go away completely, though. There were still times when I thought of him and felt that familiar longing. But those moments became less frequent, and the emptiness in my heart began to fill with something else. I came to accept the situation. I realized that our relationship had been a brief respite from the monotony of my life. It was a short but intense relationship. The connection that helped me find myself again. While it wasn't a long-term thing, it did what it needed to do. I had undergone a change. I could tell by the way I carried myself and the way I approached my days. The quiet loneliness that had once filled my house no longer felt so overwhelming. I found a way to make it work. To reclaim my space and make it my own again, I started reconnecting with old friends, reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years, and I joined a local book club, which I'd always wanted to do but never had the time for. I also started painting in my free time, filling my afternoons with splashes of color. I found a new sense of peace through creativity. I kept the memory of Jacob tucked away in a quiet corner of my heart. I didn't dwell on it, but I also didn't push it away. It was a part of my story and a chapter that had helped shape me. One evening, a few months after Jacob left, I was sitting on the back porch, with a glass of wine, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and the air was cool and crisp, signaling the approach of autumn. As I sat there, I realized I hadn't noticed before that I was content with the quiet, solitary life I'd rebuilt for myself. I was also happy with the knowledge that I'd lived and allowed myself to experience something real. Even if it hadn't lasted, Jacob had shown up in my life out of the blue. He left just as suddenly, but the impact he had on me was real. He showed me that life doesn't have to follow a set path. Sometimes the best experiences come from the most unexpected places. I took a sip of my wine, smiling to myself as I thought about the future, which was uncertain. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I was no longer afraid of the unknown. I'd found a part of myself that I'd thought was lost forever, and that was enough. As the sun went down, I got up and went inside the house. It felt warm and welcoming. It wasn't just a cold, empty space anymore. It was my space, a reflection of who I am and who I'm becoming. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a quiet sense of hope. No matter what came next, I knew I could handle it because I had already faced the hardest part, letting go.